is really important, and we don't want to talk about accidents in a bad light. We do want to learn from them. There's a whole new revolutionary change coming to the aviation world, and I don't know if many of you know much about SMS, and it's new safety management systems that the FAA has signed on to. It's prevalent now in the 121 air commercial world, but airports are supposed to start having their own SMS system. I've suggested to Jim that some of his future planning is that his group start thinking about safety and how we're going to approach safety. And I think in the Northwest area, we can do a lot more for each other into a safety management. So that's only an introduction to a whole new different world. It basically involves and rounds out with pilots having a way to share all information and manage risk before they become problems. And so I've sort of been indoctrinated in the last few years into the safety business, and I think we as pilots, every one of us, ought to be thinking a lot more about safety. Enough said. So here I am today, real quick, and try to give you some idea what I'm planning here, is that I had got my degree in chemistry from the University of Missouri. Like you, it was either get drafted or join up, and so I went and joined up, probably about the same year as you were there. And fortunately, the Navy taught me how to fly. Spent 10 years doing that for a while. I'll show you a picture or two. Out of that, I was fortunate enough to get an airline job, and I spent 28 years doing that until my government told me that I was too old, and so I had to go find another job. And so I just
55?
Well, it happened to be 60, but so you can add up the years, and after that I sat around for a year going, my God, what am I going to do? And I went for a motorcycle ride with a buddy of mine, and he said, man, you need to get a job. So I went out and got a job, and Boeing hired me, and I had the good fortune of now have retired a second time from them with about 9 years of accident experience, accident investigation experience. The group I worked with were the pilots that worked with the engineers, and we were charged with any real Boeing aircraft worldwide. And the engineers, probably the most fortunate thing I had is working with these guys that are incredibly smart, incredibly capable, but they don't know what pilots do. And so we pilots would get to go and kind of give them the pilot slant. I've got 2 accidents that I personally was involved with that we can get through today. I'll give you a quick example. A buddy of mine went, what we did, our group of 6 were, as pilots, were the guys from Boeing that would get invited to the voice recorder readouts and the NTSB. We're the guys that listened to it. And one of my buddies is there. He happened to be doing the San Francisco's 777 down there. And he's listening, and they're trying to translate and trying to hear what's going on. My buddy goes, hear that? No, what? Hear that again? That's a motor running. What is it? Well, it sounds like the seat. There's an electric seat. The guy kept trying to move the seat up, down, left, right, trying to. So there's a little human factors involved in something that a pilot might be able to give a slant to. The guy was moving the seat a bunch. Could he see out the window? Could he see well? Well, I don't know. But that's where the shrinks get involved. So that's what some of us pilots got to do. It's pretty cool. I try to state what's public information, what's online, what you can actually go find. But I think it's interesting to see some of the flight data recorder readouts and how they actually look at some of this stuff. A little bit of me. You can remember 1972 in the lower right-hand corner. Up in the left-hand corner, that's in the Navy, they cut your tie off when you solo. So that's me with about 20 hours in the T-34 getting a solo. And then a little F4 action pictures there. I think this next one's the one that George wants to look at. That's CVA 42, as George said, 3 ships, similar. 42, I always reminds me of the keel was laid in 1942. When it was laid, it was a straight deck carrier. They put the angle deck on it, and it changed the CG for those of you engineers, and the ship started to do big wallows. George can probably, and it, of course, the ship's moving this way. You're landing crosswind. Your relative wind is always from the right. The LSO, the landing signal, always right for lineup, right for lineup. And of course, you see the burble coming off the stack, off the island there. So you're always in that burble right in close. If you look at other ships, current ships, you'll see they park airplanes on the left hand, on the port side of the ship. We didn't have that luxury. You launched, we didn't have an angle cat. The cats were off the front, and you'd recover, they'd pull you forward, and before they could launch, they had to move all the airplanes to the back and then do the launches. It was an amazing thing for a 25-year-old kid.
Now, why is that picture interesting?
Because the ball centered?
Well, the ball is centered for a very specific reason. That picture was not taken from a cockpit.
Oh, talk to me.
Well, you don't have the airplane in front of it. If you're sitting in the cockpit, you're not going to get a picture like that. You're going to see the nose of your airplane.
Well, maybe a helicopter then, I don't know.
Either a helicopter, we've got a couple that were taken RF-8, but
Yeah.
the only ones that they released
With-
were
yeah.
ones straight on the center line with a center ball.
Yeah,
They weren't going to give you any picture with a high or a low ball.
yeah.
The ball, over on the left-hand side, you see the little green light there,
This-
the green bars, with the little yellow light right in the middle of them. That tells you that you're on glide slope. If that ball,
Moves a tiny bit if you're not centered. I mean, it's precision. On our ship, on that ship, the optimum hook to ramp was 13 feet if you're going to get the number 3 wire. You can only imagine if you get the number 1 wire. I personally was an LSO. The LSOs are out here on this area right there. They're the guys on the phones in the old days waving the flags. I'll tell
the net.
and the net. So I'll tell you about the net. One day I'm out there, afternoon, one of my squadron mates landing. Try to make this a short story, but it was one of the accidents. It's an accident, so we can talk about it. He came over I wasn't waving him, but another guy was. I'm on the, and you see him coming in, and of course they come right by you, and of course you hear the stories that you go to full power on touchdown in case you don't get the wire. You stay powered all the way to the wires. He came by and just went whistling. You could hear the power coming off. And you went, oh my God, and you look, and the F4 was famous, at least on our ship, they would do what they call a kiddie car. The nose would come down. If you landed short, the nose would come down, and it was a perfect harmonic for skipping all 4 wires. So now he's gone through the wires, low power, and you're looking up the deck. The next thing we saw him, we didn't see him. The next thing, you heard 2 giant explosions. Looking up here, and here's 2 guys in chutes, like right there. The next, and the NFO, the guy in the back, he was the coolest guy, the best backseater you could count on. I looked around, he had his mask off, his gloves off, he had blown his seat, so he had his raft, and he had his gloves off on the coke fittings ready to let go. The guy knew exactly what he was going to do if it ever happened. The next thing you see is this F4 going to the moon, flying, and then doing a wing over, and it was going to come down in front of the ship. Of course, the cap takes the hard starboard, the ship's going by. Next thing we see, the airplane going down the side of the ship. Fortunately, they picked the two guys up and everything was all right. But the two had the agreement, the backseater could take them out anytime they wanted. And that's what he did. He didn't like it. So, good sea stories, and I don't know if we'll ever get to the other accidents. Then while I was working for the airline, I worked for Continental Air Micronesia. I probably spent 10 years out there. This is a little bit of a route map we flew when I was there. Based in Honolulu and Guam for probably 10 years of my career. Incredible part of the world, incredible. We would leave on a Saturday morning typically. It's, I'd have to count them at 7 or 8 legs to Guam, 14-hour day, if everything went right. You take off, you go out to, well, it doesn't even show Johnson on there. Johnson Island, I got a picture of that in a minute. That's where they would burn the mustard gas, and you could land there only if the wind was the right direction. In case if they had a leak, you couldn't land. Quite a place. Johnson, Majuro, Kwajalein, Kosrae, Ponape Truck, and Guam. And when I first got out there, we were landing on 4 runways to include Yap and Koror on hard-packed coral runways with a 727 that was runways at 4,600 feet with no overrun or no underrun, and slick as snot if it got wet. It was quite an adventure. Koror went waist up. Women didn't wear any clothes. They'd be out hanging on the fence watching the airplane. It's Margaret Mead stuff. I mean, it was really, really a wonderful world, a wonderful place to go. Well, it wasn't that wonderful, let me tell you. All right, so here's Johnson. There's Yap, the stone money they had. That's Ponape, and Ponape, before they paved it, that was one of the coral runways. There's the kids off the end of the runway. At Boeing, we always talked about runway obstacles for figuring takeoff, and I always like to use that at Boeing for what's your runway obstacle, airborne obstacle once you get airborne. It's the kids out there on their little floating around. Okay, here's the 2 lower pictures happen to be Majuro. Majuro is just a tiny little atoll. What I like to point out in that picture is you can see the runway, and the dark area is not the runway. 7 left, 7 wrong, you know. The dark area is the island's water supply. And so, you know, you come in there looking for a runway sometimes with little squalls, you might want to be sure where you land. The picture up in the upper right is Truck. Yeah. Truck, they got up, they called themselves Chook, the native language. It was also a core runway. They've now made it hard surface. The other picture, the Truck Lagoon is a 50-mile ring with about 7 major islands. It's where the Japanese had their Pearl Harbor. We sunk a bunch of their tonnage there. I take a picture of that other one. That looks like an aircraft carrier. That was an aircraft carrier. That was one of their fighter bases, the Japanese fighter bases, before it got overgrown. Quite a place. Okay, here's my float plane experience. Fortunately, I didn't own the airplane when it was in the lower right-hand corner. I got a phone call one weekend after 4th of July. One of my partners had parked it up at Bremerton for them to pull out the next day. But of course, the north wind came up, swamped the float, and that's where it ended up. The lower left-hand corner is a time which I did participate in the ownership, and you might see a nice wrinkle in that cowling. One of my buddies hit a roller up by Mercer Island and came back down on the next one and ended up just taxiing it over to Renton, and we ended up taking it apart and having to take it to Canada and get it rebuilt. It was a mess. the new paint job was the upper left. This is what Boeing puts out each year, and you can go online and pull this off. You'll see this one is what they call a Boeing statistical summary. This is a summary, and this particular one is 59 through 2015. I'll show you in greater detail what their summaries come up with. They maturate this data, they look at the accidents from the year before, they analyze it, and usually along about June they'll put out the information for the year prior. So here we are in 2017. 2016 is not out yet, should be out soon. So this is relatively the most recent. Here's the 2015 airplane accidents of Boeing aircraft, 2,500 pounds or heavier. Well, these are commercial aircraft. They list them, they analyze it, they tell you whether it's a hull loss, whether it's a fatality involved, and so on. There's more data in there. There's about 3 pages. Let's go to I think the next 2 pages. There's another one down. I'm sorry, back one. No. There's one in here that's a Delta crash that was an MD-88 that I actually will mention later, that I got to listen to that voice recorder, so I could tell you more about that. It was in LaGuardia. You might remember the MD-88 in 2015, March, I think, landed, went off to the left, went up and parked itself up on the dike with the nose hanging over into space there. The short story is the MD-88, if you remember, is a DC-9. He used too much reverse thrust. You can blank the tail. He lost control, ground control, blanked the tail, and ended up going off, doing a runway excursion, we called it. Give me, click, click. There's, it gives you departures and in hours and hours and numbers of departures. I think what's interesting is there's 1,321 million flight hours since 1959 of commercial aircraft, 60 million between 2006 and 15. What I think another one is interesting is there's about 25,000 commercial aircraft flying. Of those, there are a bit over 13,000 Boeing airplanes. Go to the next one's really the one I want to look at. It's rates by year. So you can look out here, the top one's 1960 out to 15. This lower one's 96 through 15. Any of you that were flying early 60s, 70s, I can remember going to an early airline brief and they were saying, at the rate we're having hull losses, at the rate we're having accidents, we're going to be parking an airplane once a week in the future if we don't do something differently. And you can see a lot of that reflected in some of those early rates and how we've gone out to what looks like a very small amount, but we still have, I mean, a little one in a big airplane becomes big events.
Are the big events the reason why it seems to oscillate? Like there's a big event and then we kind of get complacent or something, and then a big event?
Yeah, exactly. I think if we really looked at the data, one in or two compared to 0 the year before makes data changes. Mm-hmm. I think the significant point is that with over time we are squeezing down and looking and trying to refine the process, try to become more safe. We all are flying older airplanes. Some of you flying new airplanes. But we're flying old airplanes. We're getting a lot more gray hair. We build playgrounds to try to get kids out to the airport. I challenge you. We don't have enough kids. We got to get them out of that playground, through the fence, and in the airplanes. And you guys have got to do it. Then I'll stop preaching, but we have got to change some of that, or we're going to have a dead program. Another slide. The one I want to get, well, Here's one that then divides it up into particular type aircraft. And so you can see some of the most dangerous airplanes that you could fly on, ones that you may want to fly on, ones that you may not want to fly on. Another one. Here's where the most accidents occur. It probably would not be any surprise to you if we really looked at the data out here. In the final approach and landing, it accounts for probably over 50% of our accidents. Is this data any different for commercial airplanes than the airplanes that we fly? Probably not that much. It's quickly going through this, but pay attention when you're getting ready to approach and when you're going to get ready to land. That's where a lot of it's going to happen, but keep your guard up in all these other times. Give me another slide. Another one. Oh, well, what this one's about is some of my group, we would go to industry meetings. We'd all sit around a table represented by all the different airlines, not airlines, aircraft manufacturers, accident people, and we'd classify an accident and tag it with an issue. The next slide will show you how we would tag some of them, and it's part of what I wanted to talk about today, is that what we call that is loss of control in flight. The next one is runway excursions. We've already talked about a runway excursion. Then we have a control flight into terrain. I've got a couple of accidents we'll get to today, depending upon how long we're going to last. Control flight in terrain and loss of control in flight. And they are big numbers. And if you want to start doing, and I hate this term, the low-hanging fruit, let's start talking about the big ones that we can really deal with. Runway excursions are another one, running off the side of the runway. We don't kill people running them off the side of the runway, but we destroy airplanes. And so another one that we want to be sure we get the airplane parked at the gate every time you leave. I think that's, give me another slide. Yeah, that's it. So if you could go back to PowerPoint, and I've got a question here. Yes, sir.
Wiley, that slide surprised me. I think, and maybe I'm sure you'll address this. I think of loss of control as what us amateur pilots do when we're out buzzing.
Normal flying?
Normal flying. I just never think of a commercial airliner having a loss of control issue. And so that's a surprise.
Let me think of one. Did you hear about the Japanese fellow in Japan, JL airplane, I'm pretty sure 737. Captain goes to the restroom, knocks on the door, the switch to open the door, electric switch back here, and the young man activates the rudder trim. The rudder trim runs off. The captain's still out of the cockpit. I took it out of this presentation, but I got a video of this airplane trying to recover. I'll tell you another one that happened to me. 737. I'm sitting in the seat up on the armrest, kind of sideways. My co-pilot's in the other seat. Flight attendant's on the jump seat. I'm doing the bids for the next month to try to figure out when I want to fly. Flight attendant comes up. She puts a foot up on the console. Next thing I know, the airplane goes wham! We're like this. I jump down, get strapped in. She splits. I look at his last name was Tim. You always know what's going on in the airplane, right? Well, not when it's departed, when the autopilot's clicked off and you've started down. I go, you got your foot on the rudder? He goes, no. I said, what's the spoiler? The spoiler might have come up. By that time, we've declared emergency. I'm up over Nebraska. We're headed for Denver. I've declared emergency. I want to get into fatter air. I want to be able to fly this thing. Fortunately, Boeing had built it so that I was able to use enough aileron that I was able to hold it from rolling. I say, go back and check the spoiler. So he's out of the seat. He's back there. I'm looking around trying to figure it out. Well, by the time he got back, I figured out the rudder trim had gone full direction. Well, what had happened, obviously, was that she put her foot up on that thing. Boeing had built it with 2 switches, and they both needed to be engaged to get the rudder to run. They had not put a guard on it in that 300 when they first came out.
Foot-sized.
I'm sorry?
It was foot-sized.
Foot
It was like
size,
just
perfect. We made, you know, I filed and we did, and we made reports. At Continental, they still call that guard the Wiley guard. And Boeing now puts guards on those, and they've taken it from a 2-position switch to a knob, which makes it harder. I'm going to show you, we'll get to one that I'll show you loss of control in flight. 2 Russians, one guy had been a navigator, one had been an engineer mechanic. They lost their jobs. They were allowed to be trained as pilots. They were and were flying a 737. I'll show you back from Moscow. They did a go-around, but with big underslung engines. Your nose pitches up, and if you don't control it, you've lost control. There's plenty of it. There's a lot of
that Alaska Airlines flight that
the jackster.
22?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was a
Could that be-
Navy pilot buddy of mine. That they were. I don't know how much you know, but they're basically a big jack screw and a nut that runs up and down it, and it would. It had a grease issue. I worked for Long Beach when I first started with Boeing and with a group that investigated all this. And that they could run the trim one direction basically, couldn't run it the other way until it finally ran off the jack screw. And then the elevator was uncontrollable. And then that's when they did their high dive. We call it lawn dart.
Would that be classified as a loss of control?
Absolutely. Mechanical issue, loss of control. Okay.
How about the Air France one, where they lost control of the aircraft because of the...
That to me, I'm pretty sure would have been classified loss of control in flight. Again, we're getting a lot of, that's a cockpit technology, misunderstanding of warnings. That airplane let's see if I can get this story right. They got so slow. The Airbus was designed when sitting on the ramp, wind blowing it around. If it was below 40 knots, it wouldn't set off the stall shaker, the angle of attack. So that was out of the logic of the computer. So anytime you got below 40 knots, the stall warning would go off if it were on, if you were in flight. So they got below 40 knots, the stall warning would go away. You could think you fixed your problem, but you pick up speed again and you get a stall warning. So how do we, so the technology was contrary to the human factors in the whole thing. And that's where all these shrinks get into this thing, and the Barbara Holder that I worked with, and some of these incredibly smart shrinks that are into it. The accident that up in Canada, I can show you with a whole lot of human factors in that. Did I answer?
You answered my question, thanks.
Yeah, all right. So let's see where we go next. Okay, here's a few that I was involved with. That American 1400 was one that happened in St. Louis. It was the first one I ever got, a commercial airplane that I ever got involved with. That's an incredible story. We won't go into that. But yeah, it was an MD-80. For the grace of God, that whole airplane is still alive. The guys should not have been, that airplane should not have flown. Next one was accident, DC-9. They were hauling car parts out of Detroit down to Mexico. This is the first one that I actually listened to the voice. No, I listened to the American one. This was the one that I listened to the voice recording. You sit in the NTSB lab and you've got several people represented there. You've got your screens. We're watching the traces. We're listening. We're trying to transcribe. And this particular one, they had the clock running. And we knew it was a 30-minute recorder. And there's nothing happening for 10 minutes at the beginning. I'm thinking, shit, we have no recording out of this. No, the guys might be asleep. No, I don't know what's going on, you know? So for 10 minutes, nothing's happening. Then we get into the 20-minute approach. They had to make an approach down to Satia. They got down below the mountains. They lost radio contact with control and ended up flying into the ground. There's a big story in that. But what I'm saying was the 30 minutes, I'm watching, I'm thinking, guys, wake up, do a checklist, do anything, because in 30 minutes, one of you are going to be dead. And you sit there and you just want something to happen, and it happens sometimes. There's some African ones. The Tardistan is one that I was involved in Russia. That's one we'll talk about today. Southwest. This captain was a female and not very well liked, and she was not a very crew-oriented person. I mean, I'll just say that. And the records will show that. She doesn't work for Southwest anymore. She took the airplane away from the other guy at about 30 feet. Touchdown, dumped the nose gear went up through the equipment bay. Everybody got off fine, but it was not pretty. Air Algiers and a Delta, that's the one in LaGuardia we talked about. It was in that 2015 report.
Hey, Wiley,
Yes, sir.
you indicated that this was while you were working for Boeing, but yet you're describing airplanes that aren't Boeing equipment.
Remember that Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas.
Okay,
They assumed the liabilities.
okay, I got it. Good,
That's,
thanks.
and actually, when I was hired, I got hired to start work in Long Beach. So I would commute down to Long Beach, had a crash pad down there, and I'd work as the pilot down there.
You've been very involved in this accident investigation, very involved in Boeing, very involved in aviation. From my perspective looking in, you're answering some of these curiosities that I've had, but would Boeing investigate any accident of a Boeing piece of equipment, sort of no matter, even if the cause was absolute, you still send the team out? Is that right or wrong?
I'm going to give you a little of that perspective in a
Okay.
minute.
All
The
right.
answer is, a better answer for you is certainly if it is of high enough visibility.
Okay,
I will tell you that they don't do it because of liability, although because of their knowledge, they're able to prepare themselves for liability. I will tell you that many airlines will send in a report, and there's an engineering group over there that analyzes the data and will give you an engineering data explanation for what a pilot or something might have happened. And our group would get a chance to review that before it went back to an airline. So these are major things I'm talking about. Every day there's a minor. You'll appreciate this. One of the first things I was asked to do when I went to work in Long Beach was JAL wrote in and said, tell us how to do crosswind landing.
No, not joking. You're not joking.
I am not joking,
You're not, no.
but that was my response. I'm going, you gotta be shitting me. You kidding? You want me to? My boss said, there is a reason they asked that. They're Japanese. I'm married to one. And they don't understand the word maybe. I was writing them back answers, maybe this, maybe that. And they'd come back and I finally went home to my wife and I said, what? Why don't they understand? They don't understand maybe. It is this or that. The reason they wrote the question was they were in negotiations with their pilot union. The pilot union didn't want to do if something was greater than. You gotta read through it, you gotta understand them.
Yes, sometimes it's interesting with questions in all walks of life.
Yeah.
That sometimes a question isn't what it appears to be.
That's right.
And sometimes a question is maybe to paint you into a corner somewhere.
Oh, they want you to write a book and these guys were good at it.
Abdicate a little responsibility. Who pays, does Boeing pay for that? Does Boeing, is that
Pays for what?
Do you bill, so you go out on an accident investigation in South America, who picks up the tab for that?
Really good question, because I was in on several that they set up individual accounts. And then some of that gets sorted out later. You were in the car business, weren't you?
Yep.
In the glove box, what'd you have? An operator's manual, right? I worked in the group that we made operator's manuals. The books listed the specifications, the do's and don'ts, warnings. How do you operate the car seat? Don't do it while you're moving. So every airplane has an operator's manual. So a lot of this is, let's find out what should be in that operator's manual. If there's an error in it or something that could have been done differently. So it's a cost to the business.
Really?
Automobiles, I mean, there's a recall. It's a cost of doing business.
Okay, recall would be, and I appreciate that answer, recall would be looking at it differently. And recall's recall, that's.
Well, you got an airbag problem.
But but here's an accident that was clearly caused by a South American pilot issue. And I'm
You
not
use the
picking on-
word clearly.
Okay, but well, let's say here's an issue that was not caused by the aircraft itself. It was caused by some outside.
Maybe we didn't write our manual well enough.
Okay. All right.
Maybe you didn't get trained well enough.
Okay.
Maybe there's human factors that we need to cover. Next time, as one of the engineers told us one day, he says, any color that goes on our screens has to earn its way onto the airplane. Colors mean different things.
Mhm.
So maybe we didn't have the right color. Maybe we didn't have the right warning light. This is a 3-minute video if we run it. When I first got hired, when they hired us, we pilots, they would send us immediately to USC's Engineering Safety Investigation class. And it took several visits of, I think it was 6 or 8 courses to get the full banana. And this is, I just got this the other day. I thought it'd be real appropriate if Anderson can run it. It's a video about one of the classes at USC that I attended. Please run it.
Whether it's a mid-air fire, an impact with another aircraft, or smashing into the ground, the remains are typically bent, burnt, and mangled.
I've been here.
And it's sobering to remember that all the aircraft you have here are actual aircraft that have been involved in crashes, usually with a fatality.
Somehow, air crash investigators have to figure out what happened. This warehouse, part of the University of Southern California, houses what's left of 11 aircraft, and instructors use them to train future crash detectives. This is a Mitsubishi MU-2, a small turboprop plane typically used by companies for their execs.
We look down the length of the fuselage and we see a lot of the energy being absorbed here without the energy being conducted through the rest of the fuselage. Tells us that the vector of the energy was like this, but also that it wasn't going that fast.
This crash was caused by ice accumulating on the wings, causing a stall at low altitude. The plane impacted the ground on the front corner.
A stall is not a critical thing unless it's very close to the ground. You can recover from a stall if you're at altitude, if you have enough altitude.
This is indicative of just how much force is involved in an aircraft crash. Look at all these pieces just from one small plane, and you can imagine that at one point these, I'm guessing, were probably in a field, judging by the amount of mud and dirt on these pieces. So somebody had to collect these, and then piece them back together like this enormous jigsaw puzzle as they tried to figure out exactly what happened here.
It's not just fixed-wing aircraft. This is an AS-350B from Airbus Helicopters, a type popular with law enforcement.
When we're looking at a helicopter, the dynamics are quite different. Let's go back here, because one of the things about a helicopter
Colors
that
would tell you it's an LA
is most
County
critical
helicopter.
is this
Sure.
tail rotor. This tail rotor was swinging to the right. And then if we look again at this tail rotor, we see it is deformed as well.
Give us the shortcut. What actually happened to this helicopter?
Well, in this case, it became involved in what's called vortex ring state, in which the downwash from the aircraft forces down on the main rotor system. That's the one that lifts it up. And as the power is applied, it actually forces the aircraft down even more.
So it made a really hard, heavy landing.
Absolutely.
Did it tip a little bit as well? When I look at it, I sort of
It
see
obviously tipped a little bit to the right. It actually struck a pickup truck.
It's hard to believe, but even a burnt-out wreck like this can reveal a lot of detail about the moments before a crash.
What we're looking for is like a flame type of deformation, and in fact we find it here. This has burnt away the paint, so that will give us some indication of how hot and how long the fire was, or the heat was in existence. This being the hottest part and the least paint being burnt away, this really gives us a good clue that there was a source of heat or fire that occurred while the aircraft was in the air.
She's saying this sort of trail here, this teardrop shape, is where flames or heat would have been pushed backwards because the aircraft was still moving forwards through the air
Yes.
as it was burning.
Over 700 trainees come through this warehouse every year, honing their skills. Air travel is statistically very safe, but if the worst does happen, they'll be prepared. And what they learn from wrecks like this could stop the next one happening.
The nations in the world belong to ICAO, the civilized air carriers of the world, and the countries belong to an ICAO. There's an Annex 13 that handles the discussion about how we handle aircraft accidents. It basically comes down to a nation of manufacturer, and the manufacturer will most likely be invited to join the investigation. So we have an accident that happens in Russia. Now this one I'm going to talk to you later about. I couldn't believe it when we showed up. There was, and the country of registry was part of it. So it happened in Russia. So the Russians were in charge of the investigation. The country manufacturer was the U.S. The U.S. gets the phone call. Who gets that phone call is the NTSB. Then the NTSB calls the manufacturer, and then we get invited. Now, what about registry? Nobody registers an airplane in Russia because you'd have to meet their regulations. So airplanes that fly in Russia are either registered in Ireland or Bermuda. So when we go to the room, here's the Irish, and they're there. Actually, it was the Brits, and I think there was an Irishman there. And I think it ended up with no, that wouldn't, but at least there were that many parties involved with that particular investigation. So what happens is an accident happens in some part of the world. The country, if it's a U.S. airplane, will call the NTSB. They'll decide, are we going to launch a team? If they're going to launch a team, was it a Boeing airplane? Yes, they'll call Boeing. We have people that are on the hotline. We pilots were also included in that. And of course, it goes right to the top. I mean, the big guys know about it. So everybody decides how much interest is going to be involved, how political it might be, and so on. So quickly, the GO team gets assembled. Typically, if the NTSB decides to send a power plants guy, a systems engineer, a performance engineer, and they're gonna send their pilot too, then Boeing would match that team typically. And it would be typically chosen, or that structure would be set up for the needs that they thought they might need in the field, because there's gonna be this field investigation. Yes, sir?
What's the relationship between the NTSB team and the manufacturer's team? Are they pretty cordial, or is there any tension?
We know everybody. They know everybody. And don't kid yourself, the NTSB don't have the engineering capabilities of a Boeing airplane. So they'll go to Boeing and say, we need your help. They are used as an advisor. Now, in the field or in the investigation, the part of the Annex 13 sets up a structure. There will be an investigator in charge. It's called then a party system. You show up to this meeting and you're instructed to come with your resume, because they may not want you there. If you're an attorney, even though you're a pilot, you may have a hard time getting included. Have you flown this airplane? Have you worked on this airplane? Are you a qualified engineer? And then they'll decide, the investor in charge decides whether you're included or not. They'll then set up the parties, the groups. There's going to be the systems guys, there's going to be the power plants guys, there's going to be the pilots, there's going to be the human factors, and you're going to be launched to grab all the information you can from that accident. You're going to go out, you're going to look at the switches, you're going to look at how much blood is in the cockpit, where the flaps were, the flaps. Oh, the systems guys are going to be out there measuring the jack screws to where the flaps were, where the landing gear is down. You come back each evening, there's a brief, there's an information transfer. Hey, we don't think the landing gear down. When you guys get the voice recorder, see if they put the landing gear down. That kind of information. That's typically when you get the news briefing at the end of the day. The NTSB or the investigator will say, here's what we've discovered today. Now, if you're Deborah Hirschman and you're politically motivated, you're going to spill your guts. You're going to look great. Now, fortunately, she's gone. And she was an Obama appointee, and I don't know exactly what went to her, but...
That's my sister-in-law.
Well, there you go. Well, they hated her. The investigators hated her because there was just too much information out there. Too fast, too early. The news were putting out too much stuff too early. It's not that anybody's trying to keep secrets. It's trying to keep it contained, keep it under control. Okay, so I mentioned Annex 13. It's well structured, the whole investigation, and the NTSB. You can typically, the investigations will go on for upwards of years. It's not that anybody is trying to make a big deal. This one accident I'll talk to you a little bit about was up in the Northern Territories, up in Resolute. That accident investigation went on with the Transport Canada, I think, for over 2 years. And part of it was we assembled and we went and rented a simulator, and we had to design an experiment in the simulator, and it just went on and on and on and on and on. It can be years. But in theory, the NTSB, if it's an NTSB accident, they are being directed to get them done sooner. Now for us, I should kind of mention that this is air carrier world. Know that the NTSB has local investigators. And if you have a small airplane, when the news says the FAA is on their way, it's really NTSB. And they'll have an investigator show up. They'll have the investigator go out. I heard about one up in Concrete, and apparently the guy went out, and sure enough, he put a new gasket, a makeshift gasket seal in his carburetor, and took off late at night after everybody had been having a party. And I guess this seal got sucked up in the carburetor. You know, it's pretty easy. I can go back and write this report pretty quickly. So know that in the light airplane world, the GA world, in NTSB, I think the guy's here and around the Seattle area, and he'll have to show up, and he'll eventually get around to writing a report. And write the typical obvious, whatever happened. You can go on the NTSB, you can go on all these accident investigator throughout the world, and when the report is final, I will say, unless you're in Africa, you will eventually see a final report. And it's where you can go and get public information on what's happened. Okay, here's my license. It's not, but here's how I ended up at Boeing was I got a rating 717, 27, 37, 47, 57, 67, 77, and an 87, a DC-9, DC-10, MD-11, Airbus 300, Sableliner. I like to get ratings. I like to go to school, and I've flown almost all of those in operations as a captain. So I know a lot about little things, and as I tell everybody, a generator is a generator, a hydraulic pump's a hydraulic pump. It ain't that much different after you do one ILS, you know. It's the same old stuff. Okay, here's some more pictures of my airplane, an airplane I flew on CVA-42. I don't know that guy was 13 feet over the ramp back there from the hook to the ramp. He was probably going to get a one-wire. And then when he got it, I mean, you're... Yes, sir.
I'm going back to that carrier landing picture you had the meatball or whatever it was.
Yeah.
I hadn't realized that was at the far end of the ship. I always was thinking that would be at the front end. Isn't that where the glide slope intercepts the carrier deck?
It might have been a little bit of a perspective. That mirror, wouldn't you say, is a quarter away down the deck?
The angle deck only takes up half of the length of the ship,
Right.
first of all. So you're looking at the landing area.
Mm-hmm.
It is kind of, halfway down the landing area.
Yeah.
But then, recognize when you look at the height of the cockpit there and the height of the hook tip, if you look at that, and you're dealing with a very small tolerance. You've only got, what, 10 feet right or left of center line that you've got to hit.
Yeah.
And up and down, you've got about the same 10-foot box.
Yeah.
You're coming in, I'm making this sound much more heroic.
Yeah.
You're coming in at 150 knots, but the cockpit is 10 feet above the tail of the hook. So you've got to have the mirror. They call it a mirror because they used to use a mirror.
Yeah.
Now they use a Fresnel lens. But the mirror is down, quite a ways because that's where your head is. When every airplane, if you've got a E2C, the early warning plane, much longer, and therefore you've got a little bit more.
The geometry of all of this is entirely very critical, and that's why the Navy goes what they call through Navy landing suitability tests. And they go and measure an angle, the dangle, and all that. I don't know if you, I love this part. The new way these F-18s are coming aboard, they call it magic carpet. And my advanced pilot trainer was a Korean War F-9. And it had spoilers. And I had the carrier qual with it. If you got a little high, you could take the stick and do this, and the spoilers just squat a little bit.
A6 did the same thing.
A6.
Spoiler on.
You could, and what these F-18 now, the carrier suit guys, they have now got it so the electronics run the flaps on you. And if you're high, the flaps will run out and you squat. And the electronics are set up for you to hit the deck the same spot every time. It's because we've gone from cables and wires, we've gone to electrons. And the electrons can sense, how do you think we're building these rockets that can land themselves back down? They got chips that are gyros, and they can control themselves instantaneously. We now can design unstable airplanes to make them more maneuverable because we can control them at a faster rate without the PIO and all that involved.
One final comment that you triggered. Does the mirrors or the Fresnel
Yeah.
lens or whatever, do they dial in a different setting depending on what kind of aircraft is coming in?
Sure.
I don't know, that's
Well, when you
maybe.
come aboard, you announce intruder ball 5.0.
Yes, yes.
Like, you tell them what kind of an airplane that is on the,
And most of that, I always thought was for the arresting wires. On our ship, if you were a bit fast, you'd run them out, the wires out to the full limit, and if it went beyond the full limit, you'd go into this hardwood stops. And we F4s, they would not let us land fast. If you drop the nose in close, you're gonna go around. Because you're gonna catch one of those wires, you're gonna take out that arresting wire. And our ship worked often without arresting wires because of an engine arresting gear out of service. Because we were operating at max limits for that ship. The A6 was nice and slow.
beautiful coming aboard.
Okay, what else I got here? Okay, this is just more fighter pilot stuff. Okay, this is Cold War. In 1972, I left the East Coast on what's to be a 6-month cruise that lasted a year. Saratoga caught fire, couldn't relieve us, and on and on and on. We go down to Gitmo, we do some ops, work up, and then we take off across the Mediterranean. I am, 25, 26 years old, 300 hours flying F4s, and I'm in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, Cold War. The Russians are bringing bombers out of the Kola Peninsula down to Cuba and going down to Egypt, and that was basically what we chased around for that year. But in the middle of the Atlantic, I'm out chasing a bear bomber on his way to Cuba. And then my bed is on that ship. How many times have you thought about that? I got to go back and land and get aboard there if I'm going to sleep tonight. There's no other place to go. It was something. All right, so here we are. First accident, long build up. Do we want to take a break now? I'll keep going.
Keep going.
All right.
Maybe you want to break.
I'm fine. It was a Sunday. I'm at home. I'm the duty officer. I get a ring-a-ling. We've just had an accident up in Resolute Bay, Northern Territories. Oh, wow. We're going to send anybody? Yep. We're going to send somebody. It looks like there might have been some pilot operational issues. So we make all our phone calls, arrange the team. An engineer out of Vashon Island, and I show up at the airport that evening. We're off to Vancouver to Ottawa. At Ottawa, by that time, they had decided that myself and the NTSB pilot would stay in Ottawa, start gathering crew records and assembling and be support in Ottawa, while the rest of the team got sent. I think it was a C-130. By that time, the manufacturers, the engines, it was Pratt & Whitney, Boeing, NTSB, and some Canadians showed up in Ottawa, jumped on this 130, and they're off to Resolute Bay. Interestingly enough, I might as well interject this at this point, the Canadians at that point, the TSB, Transport Canada, had decided they were going to have a practice emergency response in Resolute Bay. They had a team, the Canadians had a team on the way to Resolute Bay to run this exercise. Already at the airport was some military operations that they'd mobilized, set up some radar, set up some tents, and we're going to show that we can operate in a foreign, faraway place. So this is key to some of the investigation that later that we had that we would not have ever expected, was that the radar people were there, they had some radio communications, they kind of knew what went on, and the emergency response was a lot better. So we're all trying to gather up what's going on, what's happening, and nobody can quite figure it out. So
The lead investigator, Wiley, is a Canadian?
the Transport Canada, that's correct. The TSB, Transport Safety Board in Canada. That's right, out of Ottawa. incredibly capable, good people. I should also mention that these transportation boards not only are airplanes, but they're trains, buses, cars, and of all things, pipelines. So these teams got metal labs, they've got all kinds of analysis capabilities. And they lean on each other, voice recorder, flight recorder readouts, and that sort of thing. Okay, I think this will give us a little, oh, here is an animation of what happened. If you would, click the go button on this one. The meat of the story is on the final approach, really.
On 20 August 2011, a first air charter flight was traveling from Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, to Resolute Bay, Nunavut. This is an animation depicting the landing approach. On screen, you can see the aircraft in clouds approaching the airport and preparing to align with a radio beam, known as a localizer, shown in purple. As the autopilot began to align the aircraft with the beam, it slightly overshot the center line. At around the same time, the autopilot inadvertently changed modes, preventing it from correcting for this, and so the aircraft continued on, roughly parallel to the planned flight path. As the wind blew from the southwest, the aircraft was then pushed farther off course to the right. A compass error of roughly 17 degrees, meanwhile, meant the aircraft's instruments were displaying an incorrect heading. This likely gave the crew the incorrect impression they would eventually intercept the beam. Over the next few minutes, the pilots were busy getting ready to land and communicating with the control tower. The first officer mentioned to the captain that they were off course and that preparations for landing were incomplete. Several times, the first officer suggested a go-around, climbing to a safe altitude to determine the next course of action.
Wow.
The captain, though, was not convinced this was required. It was only when the ground proximity warning system sounded in the cockpit that the crew took corrective action. But by then, it was too late.
Think now back to the PowerPoint. Several things were said there. It took us a long time to figure a lot of it out. Now, one thing it didn't say, can you get back?
I think you can
I am, it might be me, okay? As I'm on my way to Ottawa, I'm looking at this, something that wasn't shown there. They were headed straight for the VOR. So a pilot goes, well, were they on the ILS, or were they trying to do it? Were they thinking they were on a VOR? Or, you know, and for a long time we thought they weren't set up correctly with their instruments, which in fact, you know, I guess they were, but not right. That proved to be a red herring. Mention heading. Anybody been up the north? You know, first time I went by the North Pole, I found out everywhere is south.
Yep. It's so disorienting.
Everywhere is south, isn't it?
It's completely disorienting.
You want to go to Hong Kong, you better pick the right south. And Boeing won't let you fly one of their airplanes over the North Pole, so you always have to bypass it, so you are able to continue to navigate it. And this, I mean, I was on the 777, I'm going to Hong Kong, and my first trip, I go, you know, you leave Newark, you go north. And then you watch on the flight data what these Hong Kong trips do. They go north, then they go south. Well, I went by the North Pole and went to the right. A trip several months later, I went to Hong Kong, I went north, went by the Hong Kong, and it went off my left side. Now, of course, you're always in turns. I figured I could go to Hong Kong either going left or going right. Didn't matter. She's been up there, and you get goofy, don't you?
Yeah, with the Inupiat Eskimo, they don't even look at the sun. They ignore it completely
I
because it's
imagine.
completely disorienting. So to navigate, they use the wind.
Yeah, that's
And like primary wind direction, that's how they like figure out where
Yeah.
they are.
out in Micronesia. How did those guys navigate?
Yeah,
Pretty weird.
same way.
All right, so heading is an issue. And in fact, I'll show you an approach plate. The ILS is runway 36 Tango, 36 true. So you got to get your compass to true. Now, how do you make your compass go to true? Well, we all remember those mnemonics, but even we pilots, I mean, honestly, I couldn't believe this. And it's somehow they do it, and it's a method. You line the airplane up with the North Pole, the sun, and you put the shadow down through the center line of the airplane, and then you change the compass every hour. It's different or something. There's some kind of magic that those guys can do by just sun angles and stuff. I'll try to make, why I'm giving you a bunch of this is basically what you do is you take your GPS, and they had a VOR that was to their, on their flight path. I'll show you the flight path in a minute. The VOR was to their left. And it was an ADF, So the needle needed to be pointing at that ADF, right? So you change the compass card till the ADF is pointing at the beacon. And then by the bearing that the GPS gives you, then you adjust your compass. And I swear, as a pilot, they didn't say much of it in the accident report, but I swear those guys put the needle on their nose. It would account for about the 17 degrees that we talk about here. So they had a compass, and their nose was actually right of where it should have been. And which side did they drift off of the ILS was to the right. Additionally, they had a right, left quartering tailwind that would have helped them further right. So all of that added up.
So,
Okay.
so I'm sorry,
Yes.
they had an ILS, but they're also using an ADF?
Well, you got a beacon, because that's a long ways away. I can find out where I am, kind of. You ever try to hold on an ADF? And that tool is what you use to get your compasses lined up. So you know about what quadrant of the world you're in. You kind of know that you need to be, and you got a GPS, and you ought to be able to go down this GPS and turn left and get on an ILS. You should be able to. Of course, if you're going way faster than you should go, I'll show you in the flight data that they were at 180 with trying to get flaps 25 down and high and fast. And your mental model as a captain is the weather was 800-foot overcast. I can keep pushing it. I can keep pushing it. I'll pop out. I'll see the runway. That's what I think the captain was thinking.
Had the crew ever been there to that?
Yes.
Okay, so they were familiar with the.
Yes. The captain had been, was a check airman. There's some human factors in there. Good question. The captain was a check airman. He had trained the co-pilot. The co-pilot had been there a lot on, what's those twin engine? Otter. He'd been there a lot. He knew what he was doing. He's a young kid. He was smart. He could punch the buttons. This is my impression. The old man's still teaching the kid. Let me show you human factors. We old guys could learn a little bit.
So it was the two knew each other as a student teacher?
Recent situation, only a month or
Mentor.
two from that situation. And the co-pilot still didn't have the nuts to tell the old man, you don't know where you are. That's what even they will say in the accident report. Charter flight, oh, that's good, yes, sir.
They all, it looks like also there was some significant terrain that was actually above the overcast layer coming in, is that correct? So he's thinking he could get down, probably waiting until he was below the overcast.
That's what I think. Any terrain significant, and I would be hesitant to tell you how high it was, we could look, but certainly, I kind of picture it as low marine layer, ice fog kind of thing. That's kind of my visual of it. It was a charter flight. I'll show you a picture of the rig, but I flew in Air Mike 727s that rigged up as passenger and cargo. Cargo door, pallets. They had, I think, 13 passengers in the back. Two of the young girls were twins. The chief had hired the airplane. The chief of the village owned the hotels, owned everything. He had hired the airplane, and it was the grocery truck delivery. There was bacon, there was bear bait out there in the accident site. The accident team had to run the bears off. The two little girls were his granddaughters. So they were hauling the groceries in. There was a cook that was being brought in to cook at the hotel. It was at 12:30 midday, struck a hill. The hill was obscured by a cloud deck. 15 on board, 11 passengers, 3 were survivors. One of the girls survived, the other one didn't. It was a gravel runway. I'll show you that we have gravel kits. The 727 that I flew into the coral runways, we had nose brakes. So if you really needed them, you got a third set of wheels helping you brake. The 737 has a gravel kit that has blown air that blows gravel away from the engines underneath the wings. This one had that. The weather was generally 500 feet, occasionally 200 overcast. The ceiling was about 200 feet. At the time of the accident, wind was 9 knots of tailwind. He had a quartering left tailwind. I think the ceiling was lower than they had in their weather package. And the autopilot was engaged and they crashed at 530 feet, so 300 feet higher than.
What was the comment about the autopilot was not set up to correct?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
Again, it was an airplane was delivered to Wayne. It had 78,000 hours. This is all information that Boeing quickly discovers, and we usually launch with the flight manuals, the manufacturer-approved flight manuals. What we don't know is the equipment what equipment is on the airplane. Where that became important was this particular airplane had been delivered. Wait a minute, I'm going to get this mixed up. I'll give you an example. I think it was this airplane, but I'm not sure. The airplane had been originally delivered. I was in an accident investigation. The airplane was originally delivered to British Airways. British Airways then sent it to South Africa. South African then sent it to the next carrier that we were investigating. In that time, the data recorders get changed. And any of you that are into recording data, these things just spit out ones and zeros, buddy. Just ones and zeros. And so when the NTSB has to go sort out ones and zeros, they don't know if they're looking at the altitude or the speed. And they've got shelves of information, and they would like to think, they call it data frames, they can match the data frames. If they can, then the data spits easily. After that, it becomes an engineering project, if you can't. So that's often why it takes a long time for this thing to get figured out.
Wiley?
Yes, sir.
This isn't a question that has to be answered now, and maybe even offline, or maybe at the end, or now, whatever you want to do. But it strikes me that in this app, here, and as an outsider, as in an accident investigation, it seems like we spend probably millions of dollars, thousands of hours
I know where this question's going.
trying to put the puzzle pieces together when there, with the technology that we have today, there's an easier way. There's, one of the things, and I think I said this to you, I don't know, several months back, that when something goes out of parameters, and we're not talking about your bonanza, my bonanza, something goes out of parameters on a commercial carrier like this, that you immediately start a live data stream and a live video stream, immediately.
If you were on your way to Beijing from Malaysia and you weren't on your flight path, why doesn't a bell go off?
Well, so, something that's out of parameters. Now, I know that the pilots union and on and on and on, and you can't have Big Brother, but yet, either by your fault or somebody's fault, this aircraft has gone out of flight parameters, flight norms, and now the data stream starts. And you'd save hundreds of millions of dollars.
Okay, you're a good straight man. I'm going to give you an example from the real world. German wings, the guys that flew into the Alps, flew down the valley intentionally, suicide.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever heard of this Radar 24?
Yep. The app.
Yep. These guys are Europeans. When they saw ADS-B coming and knowing that it was going to be out there, information that's out there, it's in the airwaves. How do you think we get this ADS-B in? It's information that's out there. So what they did was and you know what these SDRs are? These
Software-defined radio.
dongles, software-defined radios. You can buy them for $10. Plug them into a
Raspberry Pi or
Raspberry
whatever,
Pi,
yeah.
whatever it is. They built those and they dispersed them throughout the world. You can write them right now, and if you give them a good enough case, we could build one and set one right up here, hook it up to the internet, and it would monitor the aircraft data around us. They're even talking about setting these adrift in the ocean, if there's a way to hook them up to satellites or something. So what I'm getting at is you can go online right now and you can find any flight that's broadcasting the ADS-B data. In the case of the German wings, guys that put 3,000 feet VSI and his autopilot, started downhill, I'm going to kill myself and all of you with me. Within 24 hours of that accident, Radar 24 presented to the accident board their data. And these autopilots and that data that's getting sent out of these airplanes are now more than just airspeed and altitude. They are actually broadcasting autopilot inputs. And they showed that somebody put into the autopilot 3,000 feet per minute. We are on to what you're doing. It's how do we get there? It's going to be there. We are going to have it. I mean, it just is. You get yourself on a flight plan, your family can watch you fly to California. There's going to be more of that going on. My kid's a geek, and he's into satellites. And if you start reading the investigations trying to find that Malaysian airplane, and you start talking about Doppler shifts of satellites, the satellites don't just go geosynchronous, they wander, and you got to know where all that stuff is. It is a science. We've got smart people. It's going to come. It's going to happen. Long answer to your question. I hopefully answered it in my pea-brain world.
It seems like with our technology that we're overdue for that.
Oh, when we start being able to do ones and zeros instead of cables, we're in a new world. In silicon chips, and we're in a new world. Okay, so here's the rig. They had, what is it? 5 pallets and passengers back in the tail. So that was all groceries and the passengers. Here's the flight from Yellowknife up to Resolute. It's in the Northern Territories. It's in that area where you operate in true and not magnetic. Everybody probably understands the true north and magnetic are two different places, and depending upon where you are, the angle of the dangle's wrong. Here's the actual chart, the airways. The whole flight, as I recall, the territories, he should have been, yeah, that's 207 true there. So right out of Yellowknife, you should have been on true. Should have been flying true. You must know that the compasses are magnetic, and then we have a gyro. We take the wiggleness of a magnetic and we stabilize it with the gyro and try to blend them and try to keep. But in this case, you take the magnetic out, you set up a gyro heading, and because it's a gyro, it presets it, so you got to do continuous updates. They did have the right equipment of compass to operate in this area. We had to verify that. In fact, the engineers did find that piece of equipment on the airplane. There's the final flight path. They were headed in basically from the southwest to this place called Moosat. I think that was about 10 miles uphill. It's about 5. And you can see they were going right straight for the VOR. So when I'm on the airplane looking at it, I'm going, shit, what are they going to the VOR instead of the ILS? What's that all about? Well, that was all not true. The ground track we fortunately got because of the military being there. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had that. There's what they should have done. There's, you'll see this hillside that we talked about, some terrain. The impact, I'll show you a picture of that in a minute, and then the smear across the ground with the VR up on the hill. The runway's here, out on this side of us. There's where the engineers found the impact point. This next one will show it. It'll shock you. There's the right main landing gear, the left main landing gear, the number 1 engine, number 2 engine, and the antenna was found in that part of the dirt. Another
What's the distance there? I mean, what's
10
the
feet.
scale there? Oh, okay.
I don't know, 10 feet he would have cleared that hill. And by that time, he had decided to do a go around. They might have lived. Ouch. There's the smear. The tail's up to the right, and then the cockpit went ahead and balled off down into the hill. I'm sorry? I think, no, I'm not sure what that is. We had a Honeywell solid state recorder. By the way, in Canada, only Transport Canada, TSB, listens to the recorder. They don't invite parties. So the FAA pilot and myself are outside the door. They're in there listening to the voice recorder. They'd come out and ask us questions, and they'd go, how does that airplane work? And then they'd go back and listen some more. So we never actually heard this recorder, but they did. They took a long time to read it out. It takes, like, if you're lucky, an hour for every minute of the recording. I mean, it just goes on for days.
Do they transcribe the entire?
In the ones that I've been involved, we will transcribe them. And there's a lot of maybe saids, think we heards, sounds like. You make your best guess. Some of it you just don't know. I was investigating a one that was a Pakistani, and the noise was unbelievable. It was a weather event. I'd never heard so much rain and, I don't know, maybe hail, cockpit noise from the weather. It was unbelievable. We couldn't hear that they'd actually put down the landing gear on that. And that's when we went out and said, did they put the landing gear down? And they must have. There's military there, weather information we already covered. Okay, so some of this, I don't think this pointer's going to work on here.
The laser pointer won't.
No, that's what I thought. When I spoke earlier, out here flaps 25, what were they at 175 knots? That's way too high for flaps 25. You'll also notice on altitude they were high at that point. So he's high and fast. Why was he high and fast? He had a tailwind in his descent. He hadn't figured for that. He wasn't. So he allowed himself to get high and fast, and he's trying to get around, and he overshoots the ILS. I mean, you've been there. You've done that. You know exactly how it happened. So this is some stuff you didn't see, right? This is the engineer Boeing proprietor stuff. But they take this data, and this is the kind of stuff that we're trying to figure out. How do we figure out what they did? There's some bank angles, and there's some headings, and it, the engineers that do this are just beyond me, how they can do it. So there's an indicated heading of 330. His actual heading was 344. His actual track was 351. So the heading was an issue. We still, in my mind, we never resolved that well enough. Here's what, I don't know how many of you got HSIs, but that's what it should have looked like on his data was, in fact, that is what it looked like. The course, if you will, is the localizer. You'd tell me that he's got a cut in for the localizer, wouldn't you? Waiting long enough, not knowing what winds are, you'd eventually get there. And of course, as you start getting in closer, it's all going to happen faster. You could sit there and live with that, believing, but what if that really wasn't your heading? What if that compass should have been like this? Okay, so it was eventually decided that we were going to try to re-represent this in the simulator. Well, that was what I was going to tell you earlier. This had a, it was a 737-200 advanced. It wasn't a 200 and it wasn't a 300, like I call them, 250s. It's got an advanced autopilot. It was a very early, it was an analog flight autopilot. And a lot of this, we ended up going to the simulator, and we spent about, I don't remember exactly now, it was like 3 or 4 days. We had contracted with, this was the only simulator in the Western world, so we had to get it. The engineers had to design a test. We couldn't just go in there and act like stupid pilots and play. We had to measure this, so they had to instrument the simulator, they had to design the test, they had to say what they were going to prove, they had to appropriate money, they had to do, it went on and on and on and on. So finally, the guy on the right's the FA pilot, the guy on the left is the airline pilot, and then myself. The airline pilot, we picked him to be captain because he had flown with these guys. He knew the airport, he knew the airplane, and we were going to let him fly it. And I was there to be his co-pilot, move the gear handle. And so, and these are all the engineers down there running all their test data. And we had a test engineer. This guy, Scott, is unbelievable. Any switch, any light that changed, he's standing between the two of us. He's writing that stuff down. I couldn't believe the preciseness of these engineers. And that's the autopilot.
You have slave gyros on these?
I'm sorry?
Is it a slave gyro on the, for slave to the magnetic, and how does that, I've never used them,
No,
so
it's exactly what you say. It's a gyro. Part of the approach checks are that you
disconnect the slaving from?
Well, since Yellowknife, he should have been off the mag.
Well, that was why I was asking partially.
He should have, and we were pretty sure he was, because of tracks and stuff. And then, because a gyro will precess, and so over time, you need to correct it. I mean, it's the same stuff you do and But these are higher tolerance gyros, last longer. It ought to last for the 10 or 15 minutes of approach. But that descent check, they adjusted their compasses. I'm not convinced they did it correctly. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Here's my son that's going to do a video for me. The answer is yes. He should have been on a gyro compass, just like your airplane. This is just some representation of what the instruments look like with the compass errors at 5 DME. No, without the compass error, you can see without, they would have just been nearly paralleling the localizer. And with a tailwind blowing you off, it was enough to just keep it from getting to it. We went for hours and hours and hours and hours. And in my estimation, we finally got down to the last meeting and the engineers go, what are we going to do? We haven't proved anything. I said, well, what you, me and the FAA pilot, we finally stood up and went, okay, you idiots. All we've done is proved the capability of the autopilot and the connections, and you've just done design tests. We didn't do anything. Here's what we want to do. So we got up there and started drawing on the whiteboard, and the engineers just went, I don't know what else to do. Let's do that. We went in. The next run, we crashed the crash site. So the pilots, again, I think, helped to figure out what really happened. The winds affected their flight path. Yes, sir.
Fundamental, they were trying to chase the localizer needle. Wasn't there a procedure that if they didn't have the needle within 2 bars by a certain altitude, it was automatic go round?
Yes. That's what we call SOPs. Yeah. Live by your SOPs.
And that's what the co-pilot was probably yelling about.
The co-pilot had the GPS on his side. And there's, I don't know, I'm not familiar with it, but there was a window, and there's a line, and there's 2 dots, and he's going, pal, you're not where you think you are. And I'll get to some human factors in a minute, but the young kid knew where he was.
I mean, if he had an iPad on his knee, he would know exactly.
Another, I will tell you that I've had troubles getting the iPads to work in the cockpit with electrified windows and stuff. So maybe, maybe not. But the point was, he had the tools, he knew where he was. Compass error in the mental model, we've talked about that. Here's some human factors. I think the heading set procedures they didn't do it correctly. The cockpit was an old cockpit, and you got to live with the tools you got. We all fly old airplanes. It's got new stuff in it. Did the stuff get integrated correctly or not? Ooh, I don't know. In my airplane, I even still wonder that, or maybe it's me. Situational awareness. I think the captain, the approach became high and fast, and he knew it. The crew expected to break out at 700 feet. I think he thought, I'll break out, I'll see the runway, no problem. He thought he was flying an adequate intercept. It's almost proven he wasn't. The co-pilot, we've talked about it, the co-pilot knew where he was. I think it was 7 to 10 times from MUSAT in, he said he expressed ever increasingly concern about where they were. So I bring to you kind of lessons learned here. Man, if you're flying with somebody, I don't care if he's young and stupid, he might know more than you. If there's any hesitation, let's get out of here. Let's go talk about it. Let's get it back under control. You're not the smartest guy around. We're all getting older. And it's just, you've got to listen to what's going on. You got a little hair coming up on your arm. Let's just get out of here.
There was no deadline, there was no fuel issue, anything that made them have to do that?
Nothing driving them at all.
Sounds like an attitude issue.
Well, it's part of an attitude. I've already spoken to that a little bit. Was
complacency.
This? Well, that we talk about this. What do the shrinks call it? It was like the Koreans. This is the colonel. I'm the lieutenant. I don't go against the colonel. He's my check airman. He knows more than I do. I don't speak up.
Captain's God.
That's it. Stop that thought. stop it now.
Chain of command.
Chain of command, but
something.
some people want to live with that too much. And I mean, in a cockpit, do we really need to do it that way? At some point, the old man's got to make the decision. I had a co-pilot one time, we were on approach into Newark, and he goes, "We have to divert now." Well, maybe you know something I don't. I mean, we're on a hold, we got a delay. I think I got enough. He says, "We got to go to Cleveland." How much fuel do we need to get to Cleveland? So now he's back there scratching, figuring out. Continental 777, you're now cleared your approach to Newark Airport. Thank you very much. But he may know something I don't know. If I walked on the flight deck and guys goes, "I think we need some more gas," order it. I mean, just don't let them, don't ever think you know something more than they do. Crew resource, let's see if I can hit everything. Co-pilot knew they were not on course, made multiple statements. Full-scale deflection, something we brought up. Crew ambiguity needed to be resolved. Was the crew task saturated? Was the captain task saturated? He was high and fast. He knew he was. He knew it wasn't locked up. Maybe he was smack him and say, "Let's get out of here." Captain could have been incapacitated. Might have been old. When and should it, what's that? Like one of us?
That's the same thing.
Yeah. Should the co-pilot have taken control of the airplane? At some point you might have said, "I got it," or "I'm going around," or whatever. All right, I think that's the end of that. Part of the job that we did as when we weren't investigating, I failed to point out in that 2015 data, in 2015 there were no fatalities in U.S. air carriers.
Wow.
We were able to get to no fatalities. So when we weren't doing investigations, my group, we pilots, we would go around and visit parts of the world, and airlines, and do some preaching of Boeing, and tell them we do it this way and you ought to be doing it that way. And anyway, I got an opportunity to go to South Africa, visit with 3 airlines, actually 4 airlines down there. And I went into one of the meetings one day with the pilots. Here's this old South African. I go, "You know my buddy Smuffy?" He goes, "Smuffy? That old guy took me flying. He says, you need to go flying with me." I go, "Yes, sir." And, Smuffy was an Australian who'd gone to South African who'd gone to Australia and had flown in South Africa and knew old Scully. You can look Scully up on the internet. You've seen these Harvards, the Hobbits, the T6s, the fly formation down the water.
Mm-hmm.
This is Scully. I said, "Scully, how'd you figure out you could do that?" He goes, "I got it in the books." He goes, "You go 5/16 into that water and it becomes concrete." He says, "I can do it with a 747. One of the airlines I was in Moscow visiting Airbridge Cargo. 747 operator, 747-8. They had the new big cargo. They're part of the Volga Dnieper group. The ones that you see are those big, huge Antonovs that carry oil wells in them and stuff around. Quite an interesting bunch of guys. We're finishing up with them, and I'm in the hotel that night, the Hotel National across the street from the Kremlin. And let's see if this is the next one. Yeah. Here's the video, is on RTTV, if you'll run that, hopefully you'll run that. Oh, this is going to be too bad if you don't get this.
There it goes.
This is what I saw. There you go. Well, is this comic plot or what's going on? That's real. Next thing, phone starts. Emails start. Wiley, you're in Russia. Yeah, I'm in Russia. stand by. We're assembling the team. We'll meet you there tomorrow. And so I finished up with Airbridge Cargo, met the team as they came into Sherman Table. We rushed over, jumped on an airplane, and we went out to this place called Kazan. Really a cool spot. And it's about 400 miles east of Moscow. And we, let's see, yeah, we get shuttle off in the dark to this office building there. In high school and college, you can't believe it, but I took Russian. So I had some familiarity with how to read the words and do a little language. It was the Tatarstan airline. It's a 737-300. This was their offices. They had different airplanes, fleets of 319, 727s, Tupolovs, and Yaks. And it was a real Russian building. I mean, I remember still, you go up these concrete stairs like you did back in your grade school or wherever you went, and there was one stair that was a ½ an inch off, and everybody had to trip on that stair. A real Russian, let me tell you. Okay, it was scheduled from Moscow to Kazan, nighttime. Weather wasn't, well, I guess weather was a factor. 700-foot clouds, light snow. It was colder than shit. Winds were blowing, passengers, normal takeoff, cruise approach, no real reported airplane issues. The airplane was reported by the approach controller to be out of position. Well, I'll back up. When they checked in about 30 miles out, you're not where you think you are. You're a couple miles off course. Roger. Then the airplane was out of position for landing, and they went around. The airplane ended up pitching up 25 degrees, reached 2,300, leveled, then descended to an impact into the grass, nearly straight down. I'd call that loss of control in flight. By the way, interestingly enough, we later found out in the data, the airplane never stalled. Never stalled. How do you stall an airplane that's at 0 G? So they're floating over the top, and then they push over. Now, start going, well, my God, what happened? Is it a pilot issue? Is it a control issue? Is it a trim issue? Is it an engine issue? I mean, you start trying to figure all this out. The Russian MAC, which translates to the Interstate Aviation Commission, was the one that was conducting the investigation. As I said earlier, there was the NTSB, the AAIB, which is part of Bermuda. It was the English through Bermuda, Bermuda through England, and the FAA all traveled to the site. The IAC, we got there that night, went in. The investigator in charge by that time was a Russian, and he was the same guy that had done a bunch of famous Russian accidents. This guy was good. He knew what he was doing. He was no BS. And he started telling us all this stuff. The crew was unable to perform the landing. They were out of position. They informed ATC that they were going around. They had hit takeoff, go around. Toga was initiated. The gear and the flaps were retracted to 15. The autopilot was disengaged. The engine went to near takeoff thrust. The airplane pitched up 25 degrees. Speed dropped to 150, 125 knots. The crew pushed on the column. The angle of attack always in operation. Limitations, no stick shaker. The airplane reached 75 degrees, impacted at 450 kilometers per hour. The engines were running. We heard all this. We get in the van. They take us to the airport. Our investigator, our engineer, she got all of this from the Boeing people. It had already come from, been released. I mean, however we got it, we got it. Okay, so here's basically their flight, or it was their flight. Moscow, east, Kazan, hook a left, back around to a westbound runway. That is the flight path. This is the FDR recorded flight path, the red. The yellow was the calculated actual path. They don't come together. So I can't tell you when we really started understanding this, but I would say that I personally became aware of what might have been going on at the group. The groups are all huddled in one room. I think I got pictures of it. And I heard the pilots over there, and they were talking about map shift. So I go over and, what are you guys talking about? Oh, we're talking about map shift. Oh. Well, this 737-300 has got one, looks like you got an idea.
Yeah, I have an idea.
Okay. It has one flight computer, FMC. It is updated by VORs and DMEs and localizers. There's different ways to update that data. It's inertial data, essentially. Because you don't have two, they can't cross-check with each other. So if one's out moving around, it will be updated by contact with the VOR or nav data. This one only had one FMC. It is a known thing that you'll get map shifts. Now bear in mind, the last VOR DME that they had seen was Moscow. Now we're 400 miles away. Map shift. Navigation wasn't quite on what they thought it was. When they checked in at the 30-mile ring with the radar controller, he says, "You're not where you think you are." Now, the procedures should be, "Roger that, give me a heading." They didn't. So they continued probably operating with this airplane that had a map shift, nav data error. And as you can see, the recorder was recording the airplane's thought where it was, south. So the airplane thought it was south of what was going to have to make this left turn. In this case, I believe they also had the southwest wind, and they ended up turning left. And I honestly believe, they knew where they were, because I think they saw the localizer go by as they went through the localizer. And there was some discussion that we'll continue the turn to the beacon, we'll continue our descent to 300 meters, 1,000 feet. If we see the runway, we'll land. So this was sort of all in what I call Act 1. They basically made the left turn, decided they'd go to the beacon, continue to 1,000 feet. If they saw the runway, which they thought they might, then they'd land. Well, they didn't. Okay, now we're going to go to Act 2. We're going to go around. Toga, the airplane flight director gives you pitch commands. Power comes up. Even the old cable-controlled 737 that we still build as a cable-controlled airplane comes up. Really has no bias for the pitch. 777's got bias because it's it's got electronic fly-by-wire. So in your physiological training as a pilot, you ever heard of somatographic illusion? Okay. George is nodding his head because as a Navy pilot, when you go from 0 to 130, you instantly feel like you're getting pitched up and you want to physiologically push the nose down, but you instantly go to your flight director and set the pitch as you come off the cap. So again, I was going, ooh, I can see how. As it turned out, we're pretty sure that they ended up in just a physiological condition and caused this thing themselves. Now, earlier I alluded to these guys, well, I'll show you here, their training and their background was limited. Okay, so this was the runway, airborne airfield. The next one will show you that they crashed just downfield, about 3/4 of the way down, pitched up, pushed over, came back down right into the field. So that was about where they pitched. Now, I'll show you another little discovery I had that you might be able to use someday for yourself. Use your iPhone. It'll give you your coordinates, gives you your heading, and it marks right where you are, if there's a reason you need to know that. So I was able to actually plot those coordinates on that other chart off of my iPhone. There's what we saw when we got the field the next day. That's the wind line. And up where everybody is where the fuselage was. Just pulling protoplasm and stuff out of there. It was a mess. But there wasn't much. This the guy with the floppy hat, he's the NTSB. He happened to be our lead. Incredibly smart guy, incredibly good accident investigator. He did the space shuttle investigation. So the guy, he's the guy, he is the African NTSB guy. If there's something going on in Africa, he knows about it. And he's there all the time, he knows everybody. There's what the tail looked like. Those are the Boeing investigators. The tail is actually upside down there. But what we were fortunately able to do, they were able to do, is they could see all the tail controls there. So obviously there was a question about what the tail, the elevator, the stabilizer was doing. So they were digging into that right away. There's an engine, there's the tail, some more of the airplane. And then they start trying to put these pieces together on the ramp. Now bear in mind, it's cold as hell. And they're out there, those guys are in the wind. Have respect for those guys, man. I was a stupid pilot in a warm building. Got to go out there once in a while. Here's a stabilizer control, again, all the cables and stuff, and they were trying to verify that the cables were right. Tail again. Tail. Here's what the E&E bay, the electronics equipment bay, and the cockpit that's all together, and the wire bundles, and it says there that the control stands weren't found. I mean, it was just a mess. It was one of the first questions accident investigator is going to ask you is, what kind of volatile memory do you have on board? I'm going to bet in some of your airplanes right here today, you got volatile memory you don't know about. The ADSB, the GPSs, terrain warning. If there's a warning, it's designed to start recording and logging the last X seconds. So if you're ever involved in an accident in any kind of airplane, any kind of equipment in it, ask what kind of volatile memory is in there. I bought an engine recorder and had it installed this last annual for less than $500.
What recorder?
Engine recorder. It's nothing. If you got any kind of engine thing. So I try to data dump. Has anybody been on this Savvy Aviation yet?
Yeah.
Website? Doesn't that blow you away? This guy,
Data mining.
data mining, big data. This is a big thing now. Big data. Everybody wants as much data as they can get. And this guy, Mike Bush, will take free. You download to him your engine data. He now he's able to correlate this data by engine, cylinder, valves, tell you what's going on with your engine, your airplane. He's become so credible, the FAA will now go to him and consult with him when it comes to AD time. Is there a reason that cylinder on that engine, that particular engine on all airplanes, or a particular model or a particular baffled? And then I was on Beach Talk the other day, and the guy goes, "Don't send us your screenshots." He said, "Just upload it Savvy, Savvy Engines, whatever it is.
Aviator,
Yeah, and
Mike Bush.
yeah, and then he goes, like this. And then he says, then we'll provide you a link, and you link right to your data on his server, and you can manipulate it right there live. And so he does that for free. Now he's got his own interest in it, but it is unbelievable. And this big data stuff is a place to be. If you're a young kid, you just get into big data. If you're a young kid, you want to get into safety. It's stuff going on. Now again, here's a flight data recorder. The ones that I like to point out here, the top line is the pressure altitude. The dashed one is the radar altimeter. The other one's the altimeter. You can see the plunge, and I'll show you in a minute. They were like 43,000 feet per minute or something when they impacted. But what the hell is the radar altimeter doing? I mean, these pilots going, hey, what radar altimeter, what was it doing? I don't know, let me think about this. Well, the radar altimeter measures straight down, doesn't it? So when your airplane's like this, what does the radar altimeter do? So it
Says 0.
well, or infinity.
Or infinity, yeah, it says infinity for some
Well,
reason.
2,500 is usually the highest you read, but
Yeah.
after thinking about it a while, most any of us could figure it out. But I don't know. All right, we're almost done. The vertical speed was 23,000 feet per minute.
So they climbed a 25-degree bank. Physiologically, they think they're going on their backs.
Yeah.
And so they're pushing full
Yeah.
forward. And again, we were all taught instrument training, you think you're going to spin or something, just get it horizontal. Just
Yep.
and hold it there. And they kept pushing.
And that's why it's so important to have instrument training and find yourself in those situations and have those experiences. I mean, have you had this?
You could have had the airplane trimmed up for a slow flight, and when they added the power, it just automatically pitched up on them, and they didn't know what to do at that point except push, push, push.
Yeah.
Because they never stopped pushing, they pushed all the way.
There was a piece of that accident. No, this was the accident of the guys coming up from the Middle East. Not this one, but it was one in Russia. The guys were really tired. They'd worked so many hours, but apparently in the accident they heard the stab trim running for like 15 seconds or an inordinate amount of time that they just pushed the trim into the nose down situation. Yeah. Yeah. So I think we're close on this. Okay, the airplane was nearly 2 nautical miles off the intended course. Go around executed. Airplane pitched up 25 degrees. Nose down column input resulted in significantly low pitch attitude and high rate of descent leading to the impact. This is the human factors kind of part of it was when we were in this room, there was a lady there with all kinds of flight logbooks and stuff. And I never understood quite what was going on there. But they must have known early on that these guys had some background in training, or they were going to try to document their training or whatever it was. As the investigation went on, it became clearer that one of these guys had been a navigator. One of them had been, they call them, it's mechanics, engineers, what they call them. And they had been rifted from those jobs and given the privilege of going off to flight school or being trained as pilots. This bottom line says the first officer primary trait was an AN2. You know what an AN2 is? It's a biplane, a rotary engine biplane. And I think when I got numbers and stuff here. Captain of the flight was 47. He had an ATP, 2,700 hours, 2,500 hours on type, 500 hours in command. The co-pilot's 47, again, 2,000 hours, and so on and so on. But there was a lot of question of whether that was real or not. And sure enough, let me go on here. Oh, can you run this one? This is schematic graphic, and I think this is a lesson learned for we GA pilots.
It has been a smooth flight. The aircraft is on final approach and about to reach Category 1 ILS, decision height of 200 feet in instrument meteorological conditions. The captain is flying. His co-pilot is looking at the instruments and at 300 feet calls 100 above. At 200 feet, the co-pilot calls decide. The captain responds with go around, sets toga thrust and begins to pitch up. Contrary to SOPs, he looks outside but has no visual references and consequently perceives the acceleration as a false pitch attitude. Due to this somatographic illusion, the captain applies stick down, quite the opposite of the movement that's required. As the pitch down continues, the aircraft starts descending instead of climbing. Earlier in the cockpit, the co-pilot stayed on the instruments and saw the pitch attitude reducing, the airspeed increasing, and he called out, pitch. The captain only hesitantly responded, and the aircraft continued to lose height. Almost at the same time, don't sink sounded due to height loss. This supported the captain's acceptance of the co-pilot's call, and collision with the ground was averted. Accident and serious incident investigations have shown that collision with terrain is likely if the pilot flying is affected by sensory illusion and fails to respond to the pilot monitoring alert. For go-around, pilots need to react timely and with precision. Toga thrust, adapt or change configuration for the missed approach, and once positive climb is confirmed and called, gear up. Both pilots should fully rely on their flight instruments throughout the approach and go-around. But it's absolutely critical that the pilot monitoring always stays on instruments and does not delay an alert call-out if the pilot flying fails to maintain go-around pitch attitude. Disorientation caused by sensory illusion should then be primarily a risk for the pilot flying only. Spatial disorientation can occur as any go-around begins, particularly if it is unexpected. So keep in mind the following key messages. When initiating a go-around, the sudden change from low to high thrust can create sensory illusions. The flight instrument display of aircraft attitude is the only reliable reference available for a go-around in all conditions. During a go-around, the pilot flying must prioritize the required pitch attitude from the attitude indicator. The pilot monitoring is the last barrier if one pilot looks out and is affected by sensory illusion. But the real defense is head in, not head out, for both pilots at the beginning and throughout any go-around. Learn more about sensory illusions on Skyberry.
I'm going to give you a sales pitch on Skyberry a little bit later. Okay, this is the Boeing flight manual that discusses map shift and what you should do, but they should have quickly asked for a heading, hoping that the Kazan VOR would update them, get back on, or give me a vector to final, do something, ask for some other help. That's what we believe they should have done.
But that was only related to the fact that they had to do a go-around.
I put it in two different categories. You're building the chain, of course. If they hadn't done the overshoot, it's all connected.
Yeah.
Recommendations from the investigator was consider the expedite, I don't know that word, of extra lessons in flying for the flight crews. They should have gotten better training. They should have had more work in upset recovery training. Have any of you, I'm just rhetorically going to ask, have you done any upset training?
Mine
with Doug all the time, huh?
By the way,
Yeah, well, there's a guy that ought to take us out flying. My son is soon to get his private, and I said, I am paying for you to get spin in upset recovery
That's the
training.
best thing after a private.
Oh, I'm
Instead of
waiting.
going to instrument first.
I don't want to
get
scare
airback
him
first, yeah.
before he goes for the check ride, but I'm paying for it. He's going to get it. If you haven't recently, there's a guy to go flying with, or me. All right. Know your airplane systems, know about your nav systems. And there it says the vectoring would have helped him get the final heading correctly. Okay, then here are the media reports. It basically goes through, there was a big discovery in Russia. People are getting paid off in the schools. The schools weren't what they said they were. These guys went to schools that there weren't any records, there weren't any training records. And a bunch of people got axed. It talks about General, he got dismissed, and the Aegis Partisan, he resigned. The cards started to fall as all of this started coming out. They raided for evidence of rogue pilot training, and they had an aircraft nav qualification, and then supposedly got a commercial pilot's license from a training center licensed by Rostov Sia. It was all dirt. Investigators doubt the legitimacy of those training centers licensed by ROTSA that are shut at the present time. They shut down a bunch of schools. Fictitious commercial pilot's license. Naradko, he said that all pilots who receive commercial pilot license dubious training center will be tested. And they went back through Russia and went after a bunch of pilots. Yes, sir.
Yeah, AN2 is really a great primary trainer for
Yeah.
737.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, try that. Yeah, exactly. 50 victims now been identified. Okay, that's.
I thought you said they were Russian pilots.
They were.
It said no alcohol.
Oh, there's a problem. Yeah, you got me. All right, so that sort of sums up that accident. Now I'm going to, as your own personal research and some ideas here, I want to highly recommend Skybrary. It is a group that comes out of Europe, Eurocontrol, and they are a Wikipedia of flying. You can go there and find anything. That little video, that's where I found that. They put out periodic news briefs, you know, you can get those. They're really cool. See if you can click on Av Herald. This Av Herald is live. Oh, there's somebody trying to get a picture. Let him get that. Oops, no, sorry. All right, here's Av Herald. That's live. Right, this guy in Av Herald, Simon is his name. He is up to the minute on whatever's going on in the world. And these are, he highlights accidents, and then the pundits start piling in. But he puts the facts up there, and if you want to hear and know what's current to the minute, go to Av Herald. We go to work and check on Av Herald just to see what might have happened overnight.
Are you familiar, Wiley, with a site called Catherine's Report?
I recently have read or seen a reference to that.
I don't know who she is.
Yeah.
But I tell you, any general aviation accident,
There's
within
somebody.
minutes, you go there and she's got pictures and stuff. Maybe not as thorough or technical as.
No, as general aviation wise, whatever it was I saw, it looked like she was capable. Yeah, so there's somebody. YouTube, of course, and the Boeing and Google. Google Alerts. I wrote that up there. I don't know if you know, you can go to Google Alerts, and you can tell them to news clip for you. Every night at 7 in the evening, I get a report of airplane accidents. Pick whatever you want. Whatever excites you, you can get Google to send you emails every day, and you can kind of keep up to date with what's going on. That was where I found the USC video that's rather recent. Okay, I think that is enough of me. I think as a conclusion, I would talk about, we did talk about controlled flight into terrain. We talked about loss of control in flight. You fly into the ground, you've lost control, haven't you? One way or the other. So, and I've shown you that those are the biggies right now, low-hanging fruit if you want to use it. Think about it when you go flying. Think about that big accidents happen when you're in your approach and landing phases. Turn up your antenna for those kind of times. Hopefully we all walk away a little more willing to listen to somebody. And that doesn't mean in the airplane. Walk across that ramp, somebody's going to tell you, oh God, I just flew in and the wind was shitty. You know, or whatever it is. Listen to all the clues you got. This Barbara Holder, PhD, this lady, she went to get her PhD, but she talked the Navy into training her in helicopters down in San Diego as a PhD. And so she was real familiar with Navy training. But she talks about, I was helping her one time about, what does a pilot use for clues? When you wake up in the morning as a pilot, I thought about flying up here this morning. Look out the window. You watched the news last night. It's out, it's cold, it's warm, it's hot. How far are you going to go? You have fuel in your, what do you need to know? And I tried to tell her, wouldn't you like to be an airline pilot? Wake up in your hotel room. You have delivered your iPad, your flight plan, your weather brief. Is the airplane inbound or not? Will it be on time? Can I keep my crew here and we can keep in crew rest instead of show up at the airport getting tired, drinking coffee? You could be on the crew van, sign your flight papers, send them in. And there's a lot of move toward doing that these days. We didn't go to the weather room hardly anymore, but you could do it at the podium. But there is just, with ForeFlight, Doug's preaching ForeFlight. I would just be right there with him. ForeFlight's unbelievable. And they'll say your clearance has been received, your flight plan has been received. Expect, here is, you can cancel. You've got all the clues. If you aren't using them, you're to blame, I think. So just tune in, tune up, and go to work like you want to live today. Start thinking safety, you young kids. There's a real business in safety. There's a real business in this big data. And just start picking at something that you like, because you can make money at this if you do it right. You know about risk assessment. You know how much money is in that business right now?
More than I'm making.
Well, it's the American way.
Can I still live here? That's the question.
I bet you can.
Yeah. See.
You get known.
Yeah.
Broaden your horizon. Know a little bit about airplanes. Know a little bit about Alaska. Know a little bit about this. And it all turns into something. So that's sort of my preaching.
Good talk.
Well,
yeah, thanks a lot.